Andre Dubus was a writer's writer. He died in 1997, not especially famous, though very well known among writers. He was a master of the short story. He was also, in his own way, a very distinctively Catholic voice in American literature. I discovered Andre Dubus through my wife, who had read some of his stories and recommended them to me. And I discovered that a friend of mine in the propaganda ministry here, the public relations office, was also a big fan of Andre Dubus. And we decided to nominate him for an honorary degree at Notre Dame. After we'd had lunch and thought about that, we were going to get together 2 weeks hence to write up the nomination. And 1 week later, Andre Dubus died. So I missed my chance to have him come to Notre Dame. But it does seem to me that in a quiet, very controlled way, he was a very fine writer. A great writer, I don't know, but a very fine writer and a very sensitive Catholic thinker. So the stories that we'll be reading from his last original collection, as it turned out, Dancing After Hours, form something of a novella. They're a connected series with two main characters, only one of whom, Ted Briggs, appears in this first story, Falling in Love. I won't try to summarize the story. I assume that you've read it, or that if you haven't read it, you feel bad enough that you'll make sure you read it. But what I'd like to do is to point out some of the particular moves that Dubus makes, some of the ways that as a writer he thinks his way down into the predicament that the characters face in looking for love in the modern world. Now, the modern world that he's telling the story of here is somewhere in the mid to the late 70s. So it's a world that's 30 years older than we are right now. And to be sure, there are some important differences in the modern world, in the modern search for love among young adults. As we'll learn in a later story, one of the most important differences about this world of the mid to late 1970s from the present world is that this was a world before AIDS. HIV didn't start to change the world of erotic life, of love, of sexuality, until really pretty much the mid-80s. It had started to strike gay men in the early 80s, but it took a number of years before people really understood what it was. So this is a world that I think to many of us now as readers looks unusually unconscious about some of the more directly physical threats of promiscuous sexuality. It is, as the end of the story lets us know, a thinking through of some human possibilities that were invented, that were created, only with the creation of certain kinds of contraception. The story asks the question, that is, Ted's friend, Nick, if he's a friend, asks him to only find women who are on the pill so that he can avoid the problems he's had in this particular story. That's something that we'll want to come to, that we'll want to think some about, what the end of the story is confronting us with. Let me start from the small thing about Nick, about Ted's friend in this story. Something that is clever, perhaps not deep, but still interesting. Nick's last name, if you remember, is a Greek one. So Nick is described to us, this is on page 29. Do always bring the text with you, please. This is on page 29, about in the middle of the page. Nick is described to us as a shorter and older man than Ted Briggs, with dark skin and black curls over his brow. And it turns out that his name is Cacanus. Now, the name Cacanus is an interesting one because it's very close to meaning in Greek, the evil one. And perhaps it's not so surprising that somebody named Nick is somebody who, in this particular short story, plays something like the role of a tempter, of the devil. One of the devil's names, of course, is Old Nick, a name that comes from one of the greatest and worst political philosophers of whom we have record, namely Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli is famous for taking a very cynical view of the world and its possibilities. A view that, of course, Machiavellians would not call cynical. They would merely call it realistic. This story is confronting us with what the erotic world becomes when we look at it, as some would say, realistically, in the way that Nick looks at it, but the way that Ted Briggs himself cannot look at it. At the end of this story, we come back to the theme of devilry. Pages 42 and 43. The very end of page 42, so very close to the end here, within a paragraph of the end of the story. Ted Briggs, after the crisis of Susan Dorsey aborting their child, Ted Briggs says he needs to go away someplace. He thinks Mexico would be good. It'd be for him a kind of silent retreat since he doesn't know Spanish. So he says that what he would do is bring some books, have one drink before dinner, maybe a beer while I eat. Ted Briggs realizes that he drinks too much. He realizes that his drinking is an immaturity for him. That the life that he and Nick live is basically the life of frat boys with money. And the drinking is a part of that. He hasn't grown up enough by the end of the story, even after going through an abortion. He still hasn't grown up enough to quit drinking, but he has grown up enough to think, well, maybe I can be a moderate drunk. So he says he'll bring some books, have one drink before dinner, maybe a beer while I eat. I'll hole up, walk around, be silent. Look the demon in the eye. So the demon returns to us at the end of this story. And then the demon, I mean Nick, rubbed Ted's neck and said, drink bottled water, peel the fruit, don't shit your brains out. And Ted says, if I did, all you'd see in the bowl was water. He doesn't think he has any brains. And Nick tells him, no, stop that. It's just something that happened. It's just something that happened. You remember that that's pretty much the vocabulary that Susan moves to when she tells him, when she tells Ted that she's going to have an abortion. The way that she put it, this is on page 38, near the top. She says, I have to do something before I go to New York. I'm 6 weeks pregnant. It's a happening. It's an unlucky happening. And words about luckiness and unluckiness pervade this short story. It's a certain interpretation of one's erotic life, that it happens to you. Remember, the first lucky thing that happens in the story, I think, if my memory serves me right, is that on the drive back to Susan Dorsey's apartment the first night that she and Ted will make love after the cast party. She wishes she had a cigarette. And Ted offers her one of his, which, lo and behold, is a lucky strike. So, Nick says, it's just something that happened. Your erotic life has just run upon a streak of bad luck. You need some more lucky strikes. Things will be okay. And Nick says then, and leave the demon here. You've looked at it enough. Ted thinks, no, what I need to do is to go on retreat. I need to find a place where I can repent. I need to find a place where my being angry at Susan Dorsey for aborting the child that I begot with her, where my being angry with her transforms into my being reflective about me. That I take responsibility for the fact that I wasn't shooting blanks, as Susan Dorsey asks him. That I participated in a sexual relationship predicated implicitly, because we never brought ourselves to, in fact, talk about what it was predicated on, a sexual relationship predicated on this bargain. Any children that get started in this thing will be killed. That was a condition of what their making love was. So Ted says at the end of the story, no, I haven't looked at it, I fucked it. Now I'm going to look at it, talk to it. You can see why he wants a retreat. He wants to find a place where there's not enough chatter to break out the loud voice that's in his head and his soul. And if he stays in Boston, like all of the graduates of that minor Catholic university there, he won't be able to hear his own heart. That four-letter friend of ours, the less polite way to refer to making love, it's even alliterative with four-letter friend. It comes from, it's an old word, it's been around in English a long time. It comes from an old Dutch word that refers to cattle breeding. And if you'll track it through this story, I think you'll find out some interesting things. It occurs a whole bunch of times. But almost every time it occurs, it has exactly the function that the definitive dictionary of English, the Oxford English Dictionary, says that this word acquired, by the way, in the late 1800s, exactly when the sexual vocabulary was invented that we use. This particular four-letter word at that point seemed to stop referring specifically to a sexual act, to an act of sexual intercourse, and took on the more general meaning, or lack of meaning, of intensified feeling. F this, F that, F anything. It just means it's intensified. So as the Oxford English Dictionary says, the word came to be a meaningless intensifier. One wonders if, in thinking through this story, if Dubuque didn't use that word over and over again with some thoughtfulness. Why is this word that should refer to something that's a joyful celebration, even when it's a stupid one? Why does this word instead, in this story, turn out mostly to be a word associated with anger? with anger and with fear. So that Susan and Ted mostly use the most common four-letter word for making love in order to refer to their own rage about something, to their sense that their freedom has been threatened, to their worry that they'll die before their life is complete. So Dubusse, in a quiet way, is trying to get the reader, I think, to have some of the same experience that Ted Briggs has at the end of this story. The experience of feeling like we need to retreat from something. We need to make something shut up. We need silence so that we can hear something that we usually use noise to blot out because it's not something we want to hear. Because it's something that puts us through hell, something that seems like a demon. Now, not everything in this story, indeed much of what's in this story, is not bleak. Much of what's in this story is comic, is entertaining. It would have been easy for this story to have a happy ending, up until a certain point. Part of what this story does, and here it reminds me of the movie Exotica. Part of what this movie does is to take sex and to make us interrogate sex, to make us look at the sexual desire that Susan Dorsey and Ted Briggs feel for each other, and to ask, where does it come from? It doesn't just come from their physical desires, their physical pleasures. If that's all they wanted, all they'd need is a private room alone. Why do they want to have sex with each other? It can't just be some twitching of nerves in the middle of their bodies. So the story starts out by framing this question for us, by bringing us to that question. We're not quite sure at the beginning where Ted Briggs is coming from, as we say. All we know is that he and Nick are going to the cast party because they think there'll be interesting and easy women there. But we're not quite sure why they're interested in that type of woman. Maybe it goes without saying. But Susan Dorsey we're introduced to in a much more complex way. This is on pages 28 and 29 of the story. By the way, it will add something to your appreciation of this story, though I don't think it's a necessity, if you go find out what the play Susan Dorsey starred in is about. This play by a French playwright, Ennui, The Rehearsal. You'll notice the word rehearsal appears many times in this particular story. Dubusse was expressing a debt of gratitude to that particular play. But notice the description of Susan Dorsey. I think it's a very rich description. After the play, how did she feel? She felt larger than the room, Dubusse says. She did not show this to anyone. She acted small, modest. She was 22 and had been acting with passion for 7 years. If you remember, 7 years was also the amount of time that Ted Briggs was home from the war before it ended, in the first sentence of the story. She had been acting with passion for 7 years, and she knew that she could show her elation only to someone with whom she was intimate. To anyone else, it would look like bravado. Her work was a frightening risk, and during the run of the play, she had become Lucille as fully as she could. And she knew that what she felt now was less pride than gratitude. What does she need from a lover? She doesn't need a lover who gives her approval. She doesn't need a lover who gives her praise. She needs a lover who gives her space for her own fullness, for her own gratitude. It's not that she's boasting about what a great actress she is. It's that she feels that her being such a fine actress is a gift. And she wants to experience it as a gift. And to do that fully, she needs someone with whom she can express gratitude. But of course, with most people, even people who are friends of hers, that's very difficult. When she expresses her sense of accomplishment, it sounds like she's bragging. It doesn't sound like gratitude. So she stays quiet. She stays modest. But she's bursting. She needs someone who loves her the way a lover loves her. Alas, the only way she knows to establish that intimacy seems to be with her body, sexually. But what she's looking for is itself a very deeply human thing. It's something that, at least as she understands it, only a lover gives her. Not a friend, no matter how good a friend. Not a parent. Not a sister. Not a brother. Only a lover. Because only with a lover can she expand, can she feel elation and gratitude, as opposed to merely feeling pride and satisfaction. The word that Dubusse uses then in this story to try to capture this is the word fullness. She feels a kind of fullness. And she wants that fullness to open up with someone who loves her, someone who's in love with her. So at the party, she drinks and she moves among people. This is the same phrase, or very close to it, that describes what Ted does when he comes into the theater lobby. They both move among people, but they're not really with those people. They're looking for a person to be with. But there's a kind of anonymity, of mere anonymous friendliness, until they meet each other. And then they focus on each other. They can each see there's some need they have that the other can fulfill. And we have the description of Susan Dorsey's need before we really get the description of Ted Briggs's need. This need for a place where she can give birth to her fullness, where her fullness is not just contained within her, but can open up. When she loses this fullness, we're told on page 29, perhaps in 3 days, it'll go away. She'll need another play. She'll feel arid and lost. Toward the end of the story, after she's had the abortion, we find out again that she goes through an experience that's much like her own experience of theater. It's at the top of page 40. Soon she was in New York, but for a long time a desert was inside her. It was huge and dry, and there was nothing in it. The emptiness and the aridity returns to her. Her experience as an actress is now interpreting her experience as a woman who had a pregnancy she couldn't bring herself to bring to term. A fullness she had to evict from herself. She needs work to flood that dry sand. It's one person, the Susan Dorsey, who's this fine actress, and the Susan Dorsey who can't see her way to having the baby with whom she's pregnant. It's not that her life breaks into two things, career and private life, personal life. It's that it's one life. And part of the terrible pain of the story is that there's something very beautiful and wonderful about her. It's not just Ted, it's us too, who wants something great for her, who wants that experience of fullness and gratitude to be something that she can have over and over again. So, Dubusse has done something fairly specific and precise in presenting us with Susan Dorsey's erotic needs, with where she comes from in her erotic life, with what her lovemaking with Ted means to her. So the first night when they're together, they have a very curious conversation. Before they have it, I struggled not to point this out, but I feel I must. On page 31, this is almost too good to be true, and I'm sure those of you who read the beginning of the symposium, this leapt off the page into your mind. So they're sort of having their last drink. Here's what happens. She, Susan, watched Ted walking toward her, her glass in his in the palm of his left hand. A shell from a mortar had exploded and flung him off the earth, and he had fallen back to it alive. She wanted to be naked, holding him naked. She took the Coke from his hand and said, "I need an hour. I don't want to drive drunk." Notice the combination of the Dionysian features of this situation. The intoxication, of course, of alcohol, but also the intoxications of theater, of inhabiting a role that allows you to expand, to feel elation, to feel gratitude. Something that, as we say, you can lose yourself in. So that Susan Dorsey represents a certain dangerous but very attractive aspect of an erotic life. As this scene goes on, Ted asks her, "Were you good in the play?" And of course, she knows that he didn't see her in the play. And she'd really like to say, "Yes, I was good in the play." But she can't quite bring herself to. Dubusse says, "Yes, filled her." And so Ted gives her the lucky strike. And she inhales it. And inhaling the cigarette allows her to enjoy this sensation of fullness. And when she breathes out the smoke, she says, "I was great in the play." Ted has given her the space that she needed. You'll see, as we read more of Dubusse's stories, that in Dubusse's world of thought, alcohol and cigarettes are good things, not bad things. They're a part of what in a later story he will call sacraments of the earth. A certain way that his characters experience the fact that they are incarnate, that they're ensouled bodies, so that their physical pleasures are not merely physical, and their spiritual pleasures are not merely spiritual, but rather fully integrated into a live human being, body and soul. Their conversation after their first vigorous bout of sexual intercourse, to use a phrase from the novel Lolita, which you should all read sometime, but not right now. Their conversation, I'm sure this doesn't go on with people from Notre Dame because you're so well educated into being Catholics. But people from Boston College, God knows what might happen to them. So, this is at the bottom of page 34. When they made love, she could feel the war in him. Could feel him ascending from what he had seen, what he had done, being blown up. For Ted, it's obvious enough, even though it's difficult to articulate, that what he needs from an erotic relationship is a return to life and a way of forgiving himself for the men who died around him when he was in the war. Her heart knew she was in love. She said, "I like you a lot." She didn't say, "I love you." She said, "I like you a lot." Because love was too big of a word. I mean, after all, she didn't know him well enough to say, "I love you." She'd been fucking him for an afternoon or an evening, but she didn't know him that well. It's like people who've been living together for months, and some question about household finances come up, but they don't talk to each other about it because they don't think they know each other well enough to talk about money. Money can be more intimate than sex. So what she says is not, "I love you a lot." I would like to fall in love with somebody with whom I could spend my life, so that this feeling of a safe place that opens me to gratitude will be permanent and honest and committed, and not based on just some luck, or as it usually turns out in not very many months or days, bad luck, so that openness is something that I can devote my life to, for better, for worse, until I die. She doesn't say that. She says, "Hey, I like you. You're very likable." And Ted thinks there's a subtext. He says, "But what?" His own experience with women, such as it is, teaches him that when a woman says to him, "I like you a lot," it's not usually just that was a random thought. There was something strategic. There was a conversation she was looking to have. And Ted's also found that by and large, he's pretty good at having it. Indeed, he's a master. I suggest you study his moves closely. She says, "Oh, nothing. Am I going to see you again?" Well, he's shocked. He's absolutely shocked. "Has that happened to you? That you've slept with a man and then you've never talked to him again?" "Oh, I can't imagine how that could have happened. What was your last name again?" She says, "Of course it has. I'm easy. So are you." Well, he says, you'll see me a lot. Let's have dinner tonight. French for the play. Yeah, that you missed. He didn't even see the play. You see what a master he is. He did not have to see how good she was for him to be the man who gave her space to appreciate for herself how good she was. She doesn't need a lover who appreciates her in the sense of being a good critic. She needs a lover who gives her the opportunity to feel gratitude. If you're expecting your lover to appreciate everything that you think is best about you, keep looking. What this story is telling us about at least a certain kind of love or a certain aspect of erotic love is that the intimacy of your lover doesn't mean that they share your judgment about what's best about you. But it does mean that they're set aglow by your gratitude for what you think is best about you. Your lover lets you see yourself as something idealized, something beautiful. That's not the same as your lover seeing you in exactly that way. And so Ted goes on. After she says, you both got lucky, you and Nick. He says, I think I got more than lucky. So do I. Or, no, she says, you did. I wish you had seen me. So do I. I'll see the next one every night. And now she's getting all excited thinking about the next thing. So she starts talking about rehearsals. And about how she's ready to make it in New York. And he is so good. Because what does he say? He says, good, it's where you should be. He didn't see the play. He's never seen her do anything but drink and screw. That's it. But what does he have to know for the intimacy of love to be true? What does he have to offer her? Do you want your spouse to read all of the papers you write and say, God, you're really smart? You know, it's a lot more efficient for your spouse just to say, boy, you're really smart, not bother with the reading part. And that might be what you needed. That might be all that you needed. Does this scene ask you to think that Ted Briggs is a dishonest slickster? I can't see it that way. But it does confront you with a question of whether you're any different from Susan Dorsey and whether you shouldn't be more like Ted Briggs to find a way to be the kind of lover who lets gratitude happen because you love seeing that gratitude in your beloved so much. So much that it blots out your beloved's object of gratitude. In the end, of course, this couple doesn't make it. Again, one can read this story as if it's a sort of Aesop's fable with a cute little moral, a rather harsh one. career women aren't allowed to have sexual intercourse. To read the story that way is to read Ted Briggs not only as a good man, but as a man who was right. I don't see the story that way. The story seems to imply that Ted Briggs allowed his own neediness to make of him a dishonest lover. The pill might as well have been his philosophy. But at the end of the story, when Nick tells him, next time, get a girl who's on the pill. Ted says, the pill's not a philosophy. I'm sure you remember that the rather pointed way this conversation works. This is on page 42, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, on page 42. Whoops. Right in the middle of the page. I paraphrase slightly. So Ted says, the pill isn't a philosophy. I need a philosophy to go out there with. He could have signed up for this if he hadn't gone to a minor Eastern university. I need a philosophy to go out there with. I can't just go out there with a virile member and a heart. Maybe I need a wife. He discovered something. He discovered something about what he wanted his lovemaking to be. He never would have discovered it if his girlfriend hadn't unluckily gotten pregnant. What did he discover? He discovered he wanted his girlfriend to be pregnant. And maybe now it's going to occur to him, if that's what he wanted, maybe he should have talked to her about it before his virile member started to do its work. He had a philosophy. It's a philosophy he's found doesn't touch his heart's desires. Because the love that he wants, the love that he takes himself to be celebrating when he makes love with a woman, and he always thinks he's in love when he does that. The love that he thinks he's celebrating is a love that in fact he's always withheld. And it was only Susan Dorsey's pregnancy that made him desperately try to offer it. But of course he offered it by making it a demand on Susan, not an invitation to her. He asks her to marry him. But what he's really doing is demanding from her that she now change the contract that he entered into with her. He knew what the game was. And it's only now that he's gotten unlucky in it that he wants to change the rules. Where will Ted Briggs come back? When he goes off to his silent retreat, what kind of man will he become? We'll find out in the next short story of Andre Dubusse that we read. I'd like to say a few words about the paper assignment. I'll talk a bit more about it on Wednesday as well. You've got lots of paper assignments. You'll need to turn in a minimum of 2 of them, but you can turn in as many of them as you'd like. The paper assignments are quite detailed. They tell you to do very particular things. And when you write them, please make sure that you stick to the form that's defined in the assignments. Now, I think they still give you plenty of room for your own thoughtfulness, but they do ask you to engage with or to confront some very specific things from the movies and from the text. here's the main idea of having you write dialogues about the movies. It's hard to write a good essay about a movie. What I'd like you to do instead with the movies is what you would do with a smart friend with whom you saw a challenging and interesting movie. You'd sit down and have a conversation. And you hope the conversation wouldn't just be, boy, that was a cheesy movie. You hope that you dig into it, and that one of you's seen some details, and those come alive. One of you's noticed other details, and those come alive. And as you start to talk your way into your own response to the movie and compare notes with that intelligent friend, you both start to see more in the movie than you otherwise would. So, in effect, the dialogue assignments ask you to do on paper, and more systematically and precisely, what you would do in a conversation. Now, the typical college essay is something where you start from a more general question and then try to squeeze it down to a particular conclusion. The intellectual work, the thoughtfulness of a dialogue is different from that. In a dialogue, you've got 2 points of view. 2 speakers who start from their own point of view. And what happens as they talk is that they open up the range of significance of the movie. So, when you write the dialogues, I really do want it to be 2 speakers talking about the movie, as if they've both seen the movie. That's what their conversation's about. To characterize your speakers, I want you to draw on something very specific from the text that's specified in the assignment. Usually, you won't do your best work by just picking up a character from the text. So you could just make Susan Dorsey or Ted Briggs one of your speakers in an assignment, say. Usually, that won't be your best work. Usually, you'll think more precisely and do something more interesting if you take a particular passage, a particular move. It might not be what just one character says. Suppose you took that post-conjugal moment conversation between Susan and Ted and had that as kind of the lens you were using to look at the movie. There'd be particular things that popped out of the movie when you thought about it that way. So I want you to use the dialogue as an occasion for some close rereading of the text that you use and for using real details from the movie. And then, just as a practical thing, when the TAs and I read your papers, one of the things that we're interested in is how interesting you are with the text. And you'll help us to appreciate that if in the margins of your paper you put in references to the text so that we know when you're making one of your speakers notice a particular thing in the movie, we'll know what in the text put you on to that idea. So just put references in the margins, and it's fine if you just write those in by hand. If you can figure out how to do it with a computer, that's fine too, but you can just write them in by hand if you want. If you make some use of the text that you think wouldn't be clear just from having the reference in the margin, go ahead and write a little explanatory note about it. You know, if there's something in the symposium that makes you think of birds, and so you have a character that draws on that passage of the symposium talk about hyacinth macaws, and you think that wouldn't be obvious to us, go ahead and just explain it some. So that's the basic idea of a dialogue. Not so much to drive it to a conclusion, but to open it up into a real conversation. See you on Wednesday.